Now, the rest of the story. Émile Gravelet was a French athlete who came to the United States to seek his fortune. History books recall him by the name that he chose, the Great Blondin. One summer day in 1859, a crowd of New Yorkers gathered to watch the Great Blondin walk half a mile with another man on his back, a full-grown man. The other fellow's name was Harry Colcord, Chicago native, the Great Blondin's personal manager. There was much wagering among the onlookers as to whether the athlete could complete the feat, and so began the half-mile journey, as all journeys begin with the first step. Harry, riding piggyback, had the easy job. 50 yards, 100, the Great Blondin continued to walk, showing no signs of tiring. Skeptical spectators nudged optimistic companions with haughty I-told-you-sos. Meanwhile, the Great Blondin, panting, whispered hoarsely to his passenger, "You've got to get off a moment. I need to rest, and then we'll go on." Manager Colcord said, "Nothing doing." Nothing doing. All these people had paid to see the Great Blondin walk half a mile with a man on his back. That's just what they were going to see. Anyway, Harry was simply too scared to get off the Great Blondin's back. Positively terrified, in fact, and the reason is the rest of the story. For the million people, I mean literally more than a million, who had come to Manchester, New York, had assembled not merely to watch a man carry another man half a mile, but to watch him do it on a tight rope hundreds of feet above the roaring rapids below Niagara Falls. One slip meant certain death, and the Great Blondin felt himself slipping. Harry, still piggyback, clung tenaciously to his bearer, refusing to get off and stand on that sagging rope even for an instant. Calmly, the Great Blondin explained that it was either that or both men would be killed. So Harry, trembling, dismounted and stood on the tight rope, nothingness all around him, gripping the Great Blondin's hips to steady himself. For century-like moments, the two men stood there, and at last the Frenchman had caught his breath. "You may get back on now," he told Harry, and Harry, with much effort and more trepidation, did. And the pair made it safely to the other side that day. The million onlookers cheered for what seemed like hours, and so began the Great Blondin's career as the tightrope walker of Niagara Falls. There would be many subsequent walks without passengers, but even more daring ones, trips during which the French daredevil would carry a chair to the halfway point, sit down on the chair, do a headstand, dance a jig, another time blindfolded, another time with his hands and legs shackled, another time on stilts, and yet another time he carried a small coal stove to the middle of the rope and balanced it, and on it prepared a full meal. The enormous crowds that showed up for these adventures were tantalized by the assumption that one day the Great Blondin would fall to his death. Perhaps they would be there to see it happen. It never did. Émile Gravelet, alias the Great Blondin, died peacefully in bed at age 71. The only casualty of his remarkable career at Niagara Falls was his manager, Harry Colcord. You see, Harry, who went along for the ride in 1859, whose terror on that occasion was virtually indescribable, promptly thereafter lost his mind and never recovered. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. It was on a hot summer's day, August 17th, 1859, when Harry Colcord climbed onto the back of the famous stuntman known as the Great Blondin for the piggyback tightrope crossing at Niagara. But who was the Great Blondin? Blondin was born Jean-François Gravelet in Hesdin, France. Throughout his career, he had many nicknames, including Charles Blondin, Chevalier Blondin, the hero of Niagara Falls, but he first performed as the Boy Wonder. When Blondin was just 5 years old, he began training in acrobatics in Lyon, France. 6 months later, he staged his first public performance to a large, astonished crowd. Now, at an age when most children haven't learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels, Blondin was performing with such skill and grace that he could outperform acrobats twice, maybe 3 times his age. In 1855, 26-year-old Blondin came to the United States to perform. Now, it's unclear when he hired Harry as his manager or when they came up with the idea to cross Niagara Falls on a tightrope. On June 30th, 1859, the Great Blondin crossed Niagara on an 1,100-foot, 3¼ inch diameter tightrope made from hemp, 165 feet above the river. He crossed Niagara on a tightrope more than 300 times with different theatrical variations, including being blindfolded, in a sack, pushing a wheelbarrow, with his head and shoulders wrapped in a blanket, on stilts, with a stove on which he made an omelet, and while balancing on a chair with only one of its legs on the rope. And of course, while carrying his manager, Harry Colcord, on his back. Absolutely terrifying. Following the Great Blondin's death in February of 1897, newspapers published articles on his feats, many of which included interviews with Harry Colcord. Harry explained that during the first piggyback crossing, they repeated the stunt 3 times, Blondin set him down 6 times on the way across. Harry said, "There was a little incident connected with that great event of my life, which those who saw it and read about it know nothing. The guy ropes were not protected when we made our first crossing." Now, people bet large sums of money on whether Blondin and Harry would survive. He continued, "The people had access to them, and as there were large sums of money staked on the outcome, the temptation to pull those ropes by those betting against Blondin was very great." On the first piggyback crossing, the rope was 275 feet above the river, and it was 1,900 feet in length. Just before that crossing, Blondin told Harry, "Whatever I do, don't you do anything. Sit perfectly passive on my back. Just be dead. Don't try to balance while I'm walking." Harry climbed onto Blondin's back, and they slowly began to cross. When Blondin was 10 feet into a 40-foot section of rope which had no guide wires, they were almost halfway across, he suddenly lost his balance. Blondin reacted instantly. He knew he couldn't go back. He ran 30 feet to the first guy wire. When he touched his foot to it to regain his balance, the hemp guy rope snapped. The next guy rope was another 20 feet away. Blondin ran to it and regained his balance. Harry learned later that people had been pulling on the guy ropes throughout the whole crossing. Blondin feared that Harry would panic if he told him. More than 200,000 spectators, Harry said, stood with mouths agape the full 35 harrowing minutes it took them to complete the first piggyback crossing. Blondin and Harry had planned an elaborate dismount once they reached the other side, but once spectators could reach them, "By George," Harry said, "they literally snatched us bald-headed." Blondin continued tightrope walking well into his 60s. Although Blondin crossed tightropes across rivers and valleys all over the world, he took a special pride in his Niagara crossings. When Blondin retired, he moved to the London suburb of Ealing and lived in a house he referred to as Niagara Villa. In the late 1880s, Harry moved to Chicago, where he worked for the remainder of his life as a portrait painter. Newspapers described him as having a slender but athletic build, graying hair, and being full of nervous energy. As Mr. Harvey explained, from the piggyback rides across Niagara, Harry never fully recovered. I wouldn't have either. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. As Paul Harvey would say, good day.